Hey guys, Chris Dick here. This is part two of our ASP.NET Core web application series. And this time I've got a few things that I want to accomplish. There's a couple things that I've thought about here, and one of them is adding models. So we're going to start by adding some models to our application. We'll also create a new data context for those models and how they interact with a database, and we'll add a controller so that we can interact with it. Now, I may do the controller in a separate video, make that as part three, so that we can carry off some of these things like migrations and submitting code to Azure DevOps. These are really important features when we're developing our applications. The controller, I think, requires a little more time than I want to spend on this video, so let's get started. So let's start off by creating some models. So what I'm going to be doing here is I'm going to be developing a database that manages students. I'm going to use my famous student class, and in order to do this, we're going to use our models folder here. Okay, so all of our models end up in the models folder. Okay, and in this case, we're modeling a student. Okay, so when we think about what a student does or has available to it, we're going to start off by just saying that a student has a student ID, a first name, and a last name. Okay, so we start off by adding some properties to our students. It's going to be an integer is our student ID for this one. Um, we're going to make that an auto increment, a primary key, and that will be done by using some attributes. All right. So when we set up our attributes in a moment, you'll see what I'm talking about when I say attributes. So next one, we have a first name. Okay. And then finally, we have a property called last name. Okay. So we have three properties so far: a student ID, first name, and last name. All right. Now, some of the things that you can do with .NET Framework, or more specifically Entity Framework, is setting up attributes that make relations to other things to set up your data a little better so that it displays better or it's configured better in your database when it's consumed. So the first thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to identify student ID as a key. Okay, you'll notice I have this red underline here, and that's only because I haven't added the libraries. So if you click on this light bulb here, it usually will come up with something like this. It'll say using something, something, something. In this case, it's using the data annotations. All that does is it just adds this using statement right there. Okay, in that case. Now, there are a few other annotations that we have to do. All right. One of the things that is really important is to add in context that says how is this key generated. All right. And what we can do here is just the same thing. We're going to add in a database schema. Okay. And this one here takes some parameters. This parameter here is database generated option, and there's three options here: computed, identity, and none. This one is an identity column, okay, because it's a primary key. And by identity, what that means is it's going to auto increment each time. So when I add a new student to the database, it's going to add one to the latest increment count for this column. And you'll see this when we start to interact with the controller in the next video. So the next thing is the first name and last name. Some of the things that I like to specify is how long can a first name be? Well, I don't want a first name to be more than 50 characters in this case. It can happen, who knows why, but they do. A last name as well, maybe it's a hyphenated last name. Maybe they've got something that's a little longer. So let's make that maybe 100 characters. All right. So all this is indicating though is that you can control how big that field is in your database. So that's an important thing to consider. Now the next part is that uh, when these items are displayed in a field or on a form, okay, you also want to do some decoration around saying, what does it look like on a form? Well, you can imagine first name with no space doesn't look very pretty. But what this does, whenever it's going to be displayed on a form, that name will automatically have a space. Okay, and you can control that all from the model, which is really helpful. And when we start to build the controller and the views, you'll start to see how this is beneficial. We could do the very same thing for last name, and I just know that these are common features that I often set up, and they're helpful to do right now. Now, a lot of these features you can also set up um, in, um, in what's called Fluent API. The Fluent API is often a modeling agent that you can use within your data context. Um, I haven't really enjoyed using Fluent API. I have to admit there are some times where I just say, boy, that's just more work than I have to do. But generally, you only have to touch it a few times and then you're done. I like doing it in the model because it gives me just a little more confidence about what's happening. If you want to have more detail on Fluent API, there's lots of information in the Microsoft documentation. Now, a couple other parts that I'm going to add in here, properties, not parts, is I'm going to add in a create date, okay? And the create date means that every time I create a student in the database, it is going to create a date. It's going to add a date for me, okay? So just the same as a key, as a primary key, it is database generated. And we use the database generated identity option because what happens is it means that when it goes into the database, what's controlling it here is that the date that SQL Server provides it on entry is the date that is going to be generated. Same with this up here. The actual database itself manages the implementation of the database generated values here. Okay, so this, in other words, this one we should never have to provide a a manual value entered here. All right. So that's an important thing. The other thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to add in an edit date. Okay. I like to track these values just more because I would like to be able to see when was this item created and when was it last edited. All right. So the edit date is also it's a field that gets changed or updated, but um, it's one that doesn't have to have a value when it's created because it hasn't really been edited. It's just been created. I generally set the value to equal to the create date, and you'll see how this works later on. Okay, so we've got a model here. The next thing that we want to do is we want to start thinking about what our database does. Okay, right now I'm going to be saying that I have a database, and our database, if you remember from part one, we have a database in here, and it is called, okay, it's called our web application video. In this case, we have all of our ASP.NET tables that were created by Identity Framework. All right. And those ones were created when we ran a migration. Okay, we'll be talking about migrations in a bit. Now, what I want to do now is I want to create a data context. Now, a data context essentially represents your database. Okay, when we say represents your database, we have a data context that represents the application DB. Okay, and it means that our identity DB context kind of handles all of the features of of the database as it is, right? So in other words, in the background of identity DB context, there would be some DB sets. Essentially, these are references lists that relate to these functions, okay? And as we develop out our application, you'll see that I'm going to be using a few more of those features like user management and role management, etc. So with this in mind, this essentially represents all those ASP.NET tables, okay? You can't see them, but we are going to see them in our data context. I'll make them a little more visible. So let's go ahead and add a class, and we're going to call this DataContext. Okay, DataContext. And our DataContext is fairly simple. It inherits something called DB context. All right. When we think about this one over here, this inherits identity DB context. And at some point down the line, DB context is inherited into identity context. But we won't worry about that right now. This is essentially how it works. So if I just add in those using statements that it's complaining about here, all that means is that we just had to add in the entity framework core using statement, okay? And that is because the DB context is inside that package, all right? The next thing that we're going to do is I'm going to steal some code over here, okay? This is some code that adds a constructor for our DB or our data context. I'll just explain what it does. So when we use our dependency injection here, what happens is these database generated options will feed into our data context. So when we instantiate a copy of our data context, these options are fed into it from the startup CS, and again, I'll talk about how that works in a moment. But that tells the options. The options will say which connection string are we using, where's the server, what's the server name, what security credentials are being loaded into this data context. A lot of this stuff, unless you have a very controlled environment, a lot of this stuff you don't have to manage too often, which is kind of the nice thing about Entity Framework. The next step is I'm going to add this data context to our startup CS, because what we want to do is allow for dependency injection to instantiate our data context. So we put in data context. Okay, and what this does is it sets up these dependency injections that I talked about. And we think about options here. You can see this is our DB context options here that are actually going into when we start up our data context right over here. Okay, you'll notice we've got data context or DB context options. This is what gets fed into those options, and it's just basically saying, in this case, it's saying use the SQL server with the configuration string or the connection string of data or default connection. And our default connection, sorry if I'm jumping around here, but hopefully everyone's following me. Default connection is in our app settings. It's right over here, okay? And it tells it that it's going to be using this server, the MS SQL local DB in this case, and you can change that to what suits your own computer or your own system wherever you're connecting. My database, when we set up our first video here, we changed our database to say that it was the web application video. It's a trusted connection, and we allow multiple result sets. Okay, so that's how our data context will know how to work with this. Now, I like to use two separate contexts. One is managing the user context. The other one is using the data context. Traditionally, you may find yourself using the same data context, or you may be adding on to the application DB context. You may also have a totally separate database that handles anything that is the consumable data, and another database that manages all of the user data. So something really important to think about is how these how these features integrate with each other. Right now, I'm sort of setting you up to think about having two separate databases. They will be connecting to the same one, though. Okay, next step is we want to model some tables that would be in our database. Now, one thing that we do want to do is we want to have something called a DB set of type student. Okay, the student DB set is named students. Okay, and think about naming conventions here. We have to tell DB our data context where to find our student. This is all that this is saying. So now we know we're a student. Now a DB set is like a list, an array, collection, but it's a specific type. It's one that's specifically used in the context of databases, and in this case, a database table. Notice what I'm doing here when I'm naming this. I've got a DB set of type students, and I'm naming this students. Okay, I wouldn't call a table student. That wouldn't make any sense because it would imply there's only one student in this table. It's many students. That's generally how we want to think about naming conventions. But the video isn't about naming conventions so much as it is about patterns that we set up. So this property here in particular is going to represent a table that will be in our database. Right now, as you see, we don't have a students table here, and when we run our migrations later on, it will set up the students table. Okay. Now, when we want to get this thing up and running here, okay, I can still run our application without any trouble. It'll build just fine. Most important is that when we try to use our models, it won't be able to do anything because it really doesn't know what a data context is yet. It doesn't know what a students is yet. So we're still going to be adding those things. But we can still do all the things that we could do before. I can log in, use my ASP.NET tables, and there's no effect on the database at this point. Now, next step is we want to produce some migrations that use our data context. So in the past video, I ran a migration and I called it Update Database. So if I run Update Database now, what you're going to see is an error that comes up. The error is basically telling you that that we need, because we have more than one DB context here. We have our application DB context and our data context. We have to tell it what data context we're modeling from. So the first thing that we have to do is we have to tell migrations that, okay, we need to set up some migrations for the new context. So we have to add a migration. Okay, and that's very simple. We're just going to call this data context initial create. Okay, and I'm going to specify the context here. All right, the context is this context right here, our data context. And we have to specify the full namespace to get to the data context. And I just kind of build it up like that. All right, once we've done that, we can add that. It builds our application and then builds this migration class for us. The migration class is pretty good, but there are some things that are incomplete. So what we want to be thinking here is, in particular, our identity is fine. It's already saying that it's adding a 1 by 1. So in other words, it's adding incrementing each value by 1. Our first name and last name have a max length of 50 and 100, like we specified. So it automatically pulled that in. It's also saying that these are non-nullable. So in other words, these values have to have a value. Oh, you know what? That's not true. Hold on a second here. I'm gonna back out of this because I do actually want these values to be non-nullable. Okay, and what that means here is, and I'm going to change this. I'm going to fix this up in my my model. what we have to do, okay, we just have to go back into our model here, and I have to make two fields required. I've totally forgot that, guys. I'm sorry. So we're going to add in required into our last name and first name. Okay, that means that if anything that we're putting into our student model, we have to have first name and last name no matter what. Okay, so that's that part. Then the other one we want to do is in create date. I want to add some default values so that when the create date is changed, I'm going to add in a little function here. This is just an SQL function, and it's called get UTC date. So for whenever we create a student, it's automatically going to run this get the default value. So it will create a date of the UTC date. Now the UTC date is valuable because it's a consistent date. We're going to do the same thing for edit date. But it's a consistent date that is used when we're adding information to the database. Because if we use our local time, and let's say at some point we decide to move the database to another time zone, now our times are actually all off by whatever factor of hours we've moved the database. So if we used one time zone with UTC, that is our universal time code, it will always be a very consistent time and date, and we can use when we display that data on the client side, we can choose to adapt it to whatever global settings the person's computer is displaying. So, but that's a little bit out of context for this video. So just a thought for you. Okay, so I think we've done everything that we need to do here, and we're pretty good. So let's go ahead and run that update database again. All right, so I'm going to copy my code here. Just going to move up a bit, and all I have to do is just add in that context parameter again. And when we update the database, I'm going to try running it right now. That should do everything we need to do. Now, if I look over in our database and refresh the tables, we now have a student table. Okay. If I look in our design view, let's just double check to see that everything went out the way it was. We see that there must be a value for all four of these things. Our create date, which will be done, a value will be assigned by the database, and same with edit date, a value was assigned by the database. First and last name, those are values that we have to input manually. And our student date, our student ID is an identity column. And if you look through here, let's just go down a little further, look at the specifications. We increment by 1 and seed by 1. Okay. All right. So that is running our migrations on here. Now that means that every time we update the model of student, anytime we make a change over here, that means that we are going to have to add a migration. Okay, so I'm going to do that right now. All right, so I'm going to add in a date of birth. Okay, and this is a date time. All right, it is a field that has to be put in manually. Okay, we're also going to have a display for that so that it displays things correctly. So it'll always be showing us date of birth like that. It will be a required field as well, so that'll be important to recognize. And let's see, what else do we need to have here? I don't think we need anything else at this point. But we'll find out in a moment when we do our third video, when we do our controllers and our views. That's when things will start to, we'll have to make some changes to adjust. But let's just double check this here. We'll add a migration. Okay, and I like to just build before I go to my migrations here. But what we're going to do is we're going to add another migration. All right, and this time I'm going to say added date of birth to students. And I don't say added, it's not like a commit, but I say add date of birth to student, okay? What this is telling you in the description here, it's saying, here's what I did that is going to cause this requirement for a migration. So whenever migrations are pushed to a database, okay, what they do, and it actually tracked, you can see here, it actually tracked my addition of the nullable to false because the first migration ran and it said, hey, these things aren't required, so just make them nullable equals true. We later added in required and put it in after the fact, so it's picking it up here, which is kind of good. Nothing wrong with that at all. The next thing that it does is it says, oh, you've added a new column. And that new column will also specify a default value, just like this. Okay. It's also a nullable, so it's required. The table that it's going to be is going to affect is affected by it, and the column name. Okay. So we'll go with that, and let's run our database update. So if all goes well, it should update without any trouble, and it did. We now can look at, actually I should refresh my tables here just to make sure I've got the most recent version of the table. And we go to design, and now we have our date of birth right there. Okay, so it's things to think about. All right, now that we've got that, I think I'm going to wrap up this video, and we're going to wrap it up with adding our code to source code in Azure DevOps. So I'm going to create a project in Azure DevOps. This is called ASP Net Core Web Application. All right, so that's what I'm going to call this. I've made it a private repo, and I'm just going to run create project. Okay, so once we've created that project, it's going to give us a Git that we can push to. So if we go to repos over on the left-hand side, you'll see that we are presented with a list here that shows where our repo is. So we're going where we want to push to. If you're a command line person, you can use these the git command. I'm just going to be using the commands for through the Visual Studio. So this is our repo that we're going to be pushing to. All right. Now Visual Studio 2019, the most recent version. Let's see what version I'm on here. I have 16.8.2. This recent version sort of changed the way source control works, so I'm just going to demonstrate that now. This is hot off the presses. For some reason, this right here doesn't seem to want to work, so we're going to be using a different method here, and I won't get into why it's not working. But if we use an existing remote, all you have to do is paste that remote URL. That's this one again, coming from here from DevOps. We just paste it right into remote URL, and then we do create and push. And this is a nice thing because what it does here is it will do the pushing of the code, and that's an important thing. A lot of people tend to commit code, but don't actually synchronize or push the code to their Git. And I often say, hey, wait a minute, I know that I did this, but it's often forgotten about. So right now, it shows that we are now related to the web application video repo. And I can see that I have, let's see, I think we're pretty good here, web application video. And if we go over here and refresh this page, you'll see this stuff will disappear all of a sudden. Okay, so now I don't go back, and I can't get back to say where's my repo anymore. This is where it is. All the code is sitting right here. Okay, so all of the code that I've developed today is now existing in my repo. Okay, so that is that, and we'll continue on with reinforcement of some of these lessons over the next little while. I appreciate you joining today, and remember to like and subscribe and share it around for everybody if you need it. Thanks a lot, everyone. Have a great day.